Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds from Idaho News 6. So nice to have you with us once again for Making the Grade on this Tuesday morning. And as always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions about all things education with one of the experts in the field, Kevin Richard from Idaho Education News, joining me once again to talk Making the Grade. We have to start at the State House, Kevin, because we're now into May and the House and Senate have decided to pass a few bills at least, but they're still going.
Yeah, so let's start with the number that a lot of people are talking about and fixating on. This is day number 114 of this Idaho legislative session. It is the third longest session in state history. The longest, for those of you who want a little bit of history, 118 legislative days. That was back in 2003. I remember it well. The final day of the legislative session coincided that year with the Kentucky Derby. So you actually had lawmakers watching the horse race in the House lounge a little bit in between floor sessions. So we're already past the Kentucky Derby. So this session has managed that. We'll see. Lawmakers are really making a push now to try to finish this session perhaps as early as today.
Well, and the reason this is such a big deal when it comes to making the grade is because the biggest budgets to get through the House and Senate are the education budgets. We're talking the K-12 spending bill and the higher education budget. Let's start with maybe the K-12 budget bills, because Kevin, there's a lot to these. It's not just one big chunk of money, although the teacher salary bill was the biggest of them all, and that has now overwhelmingly passed the House after all this debate.
The biggest chunk passed on Monday. It passed the House on a 68-0 vote. It was a unanimous vote. So very different, obviously, than what we saw just 20 days earlier when the House voted down pretty much an identical K-12 teachers budget on a tie vote. And back then, the debate was over indoctrination, social justice, critical race theory, all of these social issues that have really overclouded every education debate this session. Well, with the passage of the anti-discrimination, anti-indoctrination bill, now law, that we saw last week, now all of a sudden the teacher salary bill sailed through with no dissenting votes, no debate. Now it goes over to the Senate. The Senate has worked through several of the education budgets as well. This looks like it's pretty much a done deal. And what that means for teachers is this will effectively go back and cover teacher pay raises for the past 2 years, because last year funding was cut from the teacher career ladder due to the pandemic. This restores that money in addition to funding a new round of pay raises. So school districts, as they begin to negotiate contracts for the next school year, will have that pot of money available to put into the teacher salary pool.
Do you have any indication that the Senate won't pass this bill?
I would be stunned. I would be absolutely stunned, because the other education budgets that have gone over to the Senate have also passed fairly easily. For years, the Senate has overwhelmingly supported these pay raises for teachers. It would be a sea change in the legislature to see the Senate vote this down. So, we'll see. That vote could come as early as today. I don't anticipate there being much debate. I don't anticipate that I'd be surprised actually if there was any dissent.
So, of course, we're talking about the largest chunk of money, and that going into teacher salaries and pay increases. You've heard us talk right here on Making the Grade for years now about the career ladder and adding that money into the career ladder. When you talk about this non-discrimination bill that passed both the House and Senate, and the governor signed off on with some controversy there, is this all a win for teachers this year, Kevin?
Money-wise, in terms of the teacher salaries, yes, it's a win. It funds the career ladder. It gets the teacher salary schedule back on track where it was derailed during the pandemic. But I think there's a lot of concern in the teaching profession, in the education space, about House Bill 377, about the message that it sent, and about the tone that it sends in terms of education. Even Governor Little, signing it into law last week, expressed some really serious concerns about the way this debate over indoctrination has kind of poisoned the whole debate over education and the perception of public education. And he urged legislators to get back to talking about data and facts as opposed to innuendo and anecdotes. But he still signed the bill into law. And I think what you saw with this bill becoming a law was that it opened the floodgates in terms of passing the teacher salary bill, the higher education budget that I'm sure we're going to be talking about here in a moment, and some of these other education budgets. I mean, without it, I don't know how these budgets get passed. But with it, I think there's some serious concern within the education community about, well, what does this mean? And is this going to really have an effect on what teachers can do and feel comfortable doing, can feel comfortable talking about in the classroom? That all remains to be seen.
Who decides that, Kevin? Who gets to finally say, yes, this is right, no, that's wrong? Because as you and I have talked about over and over again, districts have local control over the content that they teach, the curriculum that they teach. That's not coming down from the state. Yes, the state has standards that have to be met by the local districts, but does this fit in the standards category, this non-discrimination language, indoctrination language, or is this up to every local district to try and interpret?
I think it's more of a curriculum issue, but I think it goes deeper than that. I mean, it is a curriculum matter where every school district, every charter is going to have to look at what their learning materials are, what their curriculum is, and whether it crosses this, kind of hazy line of what you can and what you can't talk about, how you can and how you can't approach topics. But it's also a decision that, educators have to make in the moment. When a student asks about a topic, when a student asks about current events, how do you respond? How do you discuss these issues? Those decisions are going to be made locally, and some of them are going to be made on the fly, by professional educators who were trained to handle these kind of situations. But still, it's a gray area.
Could this law end up in the court system? And I know I'm asking you to look into a crystal ball, but I could see where there could be some really contentious issues at the local level that people might try and take this to the courts.
I haven't heard yet of anybody positioning to challenge this law in the courts. That doesn't mean it won't happen or it couldn't happen, but to this point, I haven't heard any talk about that.
When we're looking at the K-12 budget, one of the things that I found interesting was the federal stimulus dollars. Can you talk a little bit about the bill that is going to make sure that the K-12 public school system is able to spend this coronavirus stimulus cash that's coming from the federal government, and why the legislature had to sign off on this, and why it was held up, too?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is another installment of these education budgets that went through the House that are now, this is another one that has to go to the Senate. This gives the districts and the charters the green light to spend more than, roughly $400 million of new federal money. Now, they don't have to spend it right away, but the legislature had to authorize the spending right away. They had to authorize the funding, provide it to the schools, let them decide how to spend it over the next couple of years. They can spend it in any number of ways to try to address learning loss, achievement gaps, try to help students catch up from the pandemic. But it's a large sum of money that the legislature ultimately had to authorize and move forward. So that's why you saw the House pass it. This now goes over to the Senate.
And this wasn't the first of the stimulus funds. Local school districts have already seen some federal money out of the stimulus. And it's going to be fascinating for us as journalists to cover over the next couple of years, as you said, how local districts decide to spend this money, what works, what doesn't work. Because Kevin, as you well know, what we've talked about here on Making the Grade for years is that local districts are very wary to spend one-time money on a continuing program because they worry they won't be able to continue to fund it, which makes a lot of sense. But how do you look at learning loss? How do you look at what's happened with students during the pandemic and try and spend this essentially one-time money to fix that problem?
Yeah, and again, this is, as you said, this is the third round of federal stimulus money for education, but it is the largest by a pretty fair margin. So we're talking about a lot of money that districts have and have access to. But you're right. What do you put in place? How do you help students in these next couple of years? And how do you make sure that you haven't established a program that you're going to be having to figure out how to fund long term, and how to keep it going, or phase out a program? And that's, the money it's helpful, but it also can cause some complications.
Yeah, two-edged sword. Isn't that what they say?
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so wrapping up K-12 public budget, pretty much things sit in the Senate right now, correct?
Yeah, the House is pretty much done now with the K-12 budgets. The Senate has actually passed several of them. They passed, I believe, 4 of the 7 K-12 budgets on Monday. So that's moving along. Now, those other K-12 budgets and the budget that authorizes spending these federal stimulus dollars, that all goes over to the Senate, and we could see action on any of those bills perhaps as early as today.
So let's move to higher education, because you thought the K-12 budget was contentious. As you've heard us talking about on Making the Grade here, this is the higher education budget was a hot topic before the legislature even began. Again, because of some of these similar topics that the K-12 budget came under scrutiny with non-discrimination and indoctrination and critical race theory. And Boise State took a hit in this budget that did end up passing the House finally.
Yes, so this is a budget that it includes some deeper cuts to Boise State and to University of Idaho and Idaho State University. We're talking about $2.5 million in cuts designed to, eliminate spending on social justice programs, or to get some sort, which is a moving target. Nobody really knows exactly how much or how little is being spent on these social justice programs. And there's a punitive aspect to these cuts. There's no question about that. Even the sponsors of the bill have said, that this is a political budget. I mean, this is a budget that's designed to try to pass both houses. It's less than the governor asked for. It's less than the original budget that failed on the House floor almost a month ago. And we saw really some tense debate on the House floor over this budget. Some conservatives wanting deeper cuts in this budget. Some more mainstream moderate Republicans saying, look, we've had the debate over social justice. We've had the debate over indoctrination. We passed this anti-indoctrination law. Let's move on and pass a budget. Carolyn Nielsen Troy, a lawmaker from Genesee, which is right near the University of Idaho, said, look, university officials have gotten the message. They're not dead. They're PhDs. They get it. And so let's pass a budget, give them the money. Let's move along here. Democrats supported this budget, but with some real reservations. Chris Mathias, a Democrat from Boise, the lone member of the House who is a person of color, really was passionate in his debate on this bill, saying, what is the fear here in terms of social justice, in terms of trying to address these social issues? He said he's been very disappointed and very disheartened by the tone of this debate. Very passionate debate from Representative Mathias. Several conservative lawmakers rose to object to his debate. In the end, this bill passed fairly handily. 49-20 was the final vote tally, but very clear from the debate on the House floor. A lot of hard feelings about this budget, and a lot of concerns on all sides in terms of the message that higher education is sending and the message that the state is sending to higher education.
And probably the debate is not over, although I would think that you're going to say that the Senate will probably pass this pretty easily as well.
Given that the Senate easily passed the first version of the higher education budget, which was slightly larger and much more in line with what Governor Little requested back in January, again, a lot like what I said with the teacher salary budget, it would be a stunning turn of events for the Senate to now turn around and reject this higher education budget. I think we'll see some, we may hear some debate. There may be some back and forth. May not be an unanimous vote, but I would be surprised if the Senate didn't follow suit.
Kevin, I know we always at this point in the session, usually it's the end of March or perhaps in April, but we're going to do it in May instead, is we kind of like to play this legislative end game where you and I have a chance to talk about what is it going to take for the session to be over. And this year, more than any other, I think that, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I believe that the education budgets played a massive role in the legislative endgame. So even though you and I can sit here and talk about tax relief and some of the other major budget bills that the House and Senate needed to pass, education was at the top of this debate. And it had, again, very little to do with the amount of money. It had everything to do with social justice issues.
And the budgets became some of the last big bills to get addressed on the floor of the House and the Senate. And you're right, it's because of these social justice debates, because of this whole furor over indoctrination in the schools, that put the education budgets on hold. Even the budgets that weren't voted down in the House. I mean, that slows down the process right there. When a budget bill is rejected by either the House or the Senate, you got to start over. You got to run through committee with a new version of the budget. So yes, education became one of the major sticking points of this session. Not the only one, and not the only one as we sit here at 10:20 on Tuesday morning of what might be the final day of the legislative session. We still have debates over property tax reform. We still have debates over separation of powers between the governor and the legislative branch. Those are still unresolved issues, maybe not of direct impact to education, but definitely of direct impact in terms of the legislature wrapping up business and closing out the session.
But the legislature is up against it at this point too, Kevin. They've got to get this done because there are some departments that the state needs to figure out how they're going to continue forward and not be in limbo land when it comes to having cash on hand.
It's a lingering debate that the legislature is also trying to resolve here in the final hours of what happens with some of these budget bills and what happens with state employees. So it gets a little bit wonky, but here's the short answer to this. The short explanation to this is that according to the Constitution, new laws don't go into effect until 60 days after the legislature adjourns. Now, the problem with the 60-day timeline is that on July 1st, the new state budget year goes into effect. So if you're within that 60-day window, the new budget year begins before the new budgets go into effect. So you've got a funding gap for however long that, however long it takes to get the new budget bills to go into effect. So this is a question, it's a constitutional issue, and the concern is that if it isn't resolved in a manner that passes constitutional muster, that state employees may be forced to go without a paycheck. And you may have first responders. Worst case scenario here is that first responders like state patrol, state police, they won't be able to work. So the legislature is trying to figure out a workaround to make sure that the budgets go into effect so that there isn't a government shutdown. So yes, one more unresolved issue as this session nears its conclusion.
All right. So I don't know how many times I've asked you this. It's been a bunch, but any thoughts? When do they wrap? When's it done? Is it done today?
Well, there's a hope that House Majority Leader Mike Moyle is hoping that they can wrap up their work and be done today. It feels like there's a lot of work to be done, and I've watched enough end of the session. I watched the close of enough legislative sessions to know that it doesn't take much in the way of a hiccup, a time delay of any kind to kind of throw the schedule off. So today is pretty optimistical. If they try to adjourn today, a lot of things have to go right, and a lot of things have to fall into place. I think almost certainly the legislature wants to adjourn this week. I don't think there are many legislators who want this session to go down in history as the longest in the history of the state. So I think that, I think that becomes a bit of a deadline here. I think that, provides a little bit of motivation to get this thing wrapped up this week. And today may be the day. It could be Wednesday, it could be Thursday. We'll see.
I think it all depends on your ugly tie.
Ugly ties kind of fell out of favor. A lot of us have been, not at the session in person much. So the ugly tie thing is not happening as much.
That's what we're going to blame it on. Nobody's wearing ugly ties, so the session's never going to end. That's
right. If there has to be a scapegoat, we'll just go with the ugly ties.
Blame it on that. Kev, let's take a little bit of a right turn. I want us to bring everybody up to date, and if you have questions or comments about any of this, sure, feel free to give them to us here live. But I want to do a quick look at coronavirus case numbers, so we can start with the K through 12 system. Of course, Idaho Education News has been tracking coronavirus cases in our local schools since the pandemic began. And this continues, as we had hoped it would be as the vaccine rollout came about, to be good news in the local school systems. And case numbers are down.
They are. They're about the lowest numbers we've seen since October, when Health and Welfare first began tracking these coronavirus case numbers. And you can see the bar chart. It's a snapshot. I keep saying this every time we talk about these numbers. It's not a full picture. We're not hearing from every school. The smaller schools don't have to report. The numbers are sometimes an estimate, but when you look at it in total, and you look at it as an apples to apples comparison, the numbers have dropped, and the numbers have stayed fairly low for a couple of months here. So that's an encouraging sign as K-12 looks to close out the school year here in the next few weeks. Higher education, kind of a similar story. Most of the colleges and universities are reporting just a handful of cases. There was an uptick at the University of Idaho in the past week or so, but even those numbers are fairly low compared to what we saw in the fall. So, same story with the colleges and universities trying to wrap up spring semester. In some cases, doing so remotely. Switching back to a remote model, as Boise State did, as Idaho State did. So as that semester wraps up, also some encouraging news.
Have the higher education administrators made a push yet for what happens exactly in the fall, or is that still being decided?
I think they're all talking about trying to get back to as close to normal as possible, with as much of a face-to-face learning component and as much of a return to normal campus operations. The next few months will tell the tale, but I think college and university leaders are pretty optimistic. I think part of the optimism is based in the vaccines, the ability for anybody over the age of 16 now can get the vaccine. The hope is that the vaccine will be in widespread enough use that the colleges and universities can return to a more normal campus operation.
I think everybody's hoping for that, no doubt. And one more topic before I let you go, Kev. Let's talk about Reclaim Idaho, because there is a new initiative by this group. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because they were the grassroots effort behind the 2018 Medicaid expansion that happened in the state of Idaho. They have been trying to kind of put together an initiative that would help public schools get more funding, trying to do this by essentially corporate tax and personal income tax. And they're back after trying to figure out how to gather signatures. So tell us a little bit about what Reclaim Idaho wants to do now.
Right. So Reclaim Idaho is back, possibly with another initiative, and it's very similar to an initiative that they pushed back in 2020, an initiative that was derailed because of the pandemic, because of it was impossible for Reclaim Idaho to gather signatures in person. They tried to do a virtual signature gathering drive. Got support in federal court. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled last year and put the the virtual signature gathering drive on hold, which essentially shut down the 2020 version of this education funding initiative. Reclaim Idaho filed paperwork for a very similar initiative that could appear on the ballot as early as 2022. And what it would do is it would increase income taxes for wealthy Idahoans and for corporations, with the money going into a fund for education, for K-12 education. Now, the hang up and the complication of why I'm saying that this may be something that Reclaim Idaho pushes for in 2022 is that the group is also planning a lawsuit against the state. If you recall, back in April, the governor signed a bill into law that will make it very difficult for any citizens group to get an initiative on the ballot. It requires these groups to get a minimum number of signatures in all 35 legislative districts. So you really have to fan across the state to get signatures to get an initiative on the ballot. Reclaim Idaho is taking the state to court, or planning to take the state to court, challenging the constitutionality of that new law. What the group is saying is if they win in court on that constitutional challenge, they would then pursue the education funding initiative. So kind of a two-step process here.
And a bit of a long haul look.
And definitely a long haul. It's going to be a while before we know exactly what's happening with the legal challenge and in turn what's happening with this K-12 initiative.
I feel like that's the theme right now, the long haul look, whether we're talking about the pandemic or the legislature or an initiative that might happen 2 years down the road. Things are certainly kind of in slow-mo right now, Kevin.
The session it's felt like a long haul, 114 days anyway you look at it, whether it turns out to be the longest session in state history or not. It has been a long session. I don't think anybody would dispute that.
So if people want to get the very latest information from you guys, how do they do that?
Just follow us at idahoednews.org. We'll have daily coverage of the legislative endgame for however long that takes. We'll also have ongoing coverage of local education, state politics, even some federal education. We were also able to sit in a little bit this week. Education Writers Association had its annual conference for us education reporters. Got to hear from the new Secretary of Education. Sammy Edge had a story about that that's posted on our website, so you can get a little bit of federal education policy in addition to all of what's going on at the State House and everything that's going on at the local level.
Well, we really appreciate all that you guys have been doing, both virtually and now that you're vaccinated up, you can walk on down to the State House for us too. So that's fun. Yes,
covering this end game in person, which is a good feeling. It's a lot better, to be covering anything in person as opposed to covering it virtually. I mean, we're all suffering from a little bit of Zoom fatigue, so it's good to see the session in person again.
Well, whether it be in person or by Zoom, it's always a pleasure, Kevin. So thank you for being here, for making the grade. Enjoyed having you. And again, go to idahoednews.org to get an update on all of these stories and what's to come, whether the ledge ends up sine dying? Is that correct language?
No. They adjourn sine die.
Thank you. When they decide
we hope that they adjourn sine die here at some point fairly soon.
You can get all of that at idahoednews.org. Kevin, have a great day. Thanks for being here, for making the grade.
Thanks, Michelle. Have a good week, all.